From Capitol News, Illinois, the Democratic House caucus has been rocked again with charges of corruption and personal misbehavior. A federal appeals court says the state's assault weapons ban is constitutional, but the U.S. Supreme Court may see things differently. Donald Trump's Justice Department is threatening to prosecute state election officials if any non-citizens are allowed to register or cast ballots. And as the state's school finance system turns 10 years old, educational equity is still an elusive target in Illinois. It's Friday, July 10th. We'll talk about those stories on this edition of Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capitol News, Illinois. I'm Peter Hancock, and I'm joined this week by my colleagues Ben Szalinski and Hannah Meisel, as well as our editor-in-chief, Jerry Nowicki. We're supposed to be in the dog days of summer, but this has been a surprisingly busy week, so we'll dive right into it, starting with this week in Illinois legislative corruption. In the time since our last podcast, just before the 4th of July weekend, two scandals have hit the front pages. First, State Representative Harry Benton from Plainfield was forced to resign by House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch. That came after a legislative inspector general report apparently confirmed some sort of unnamed misbehavior. And then, unrelated to that, State Representative Carol Ammons of Urbana came under federal indictment, along with her husband, for steering public money to organizations that employed her daughter, as well as misusing campaign funds. In that case, Speaker Welch did not immediately come out and demand her resignation. Here he is talking with reporters on Wednesday.
She's entitled to due process. And I believe the court system is the proper place for that to happen. However, we have processes in place that if they are invoked, we will use those processes. That is the right of our members. If those processes are invoked, we will use those. I believe that is additional due process as well. Going back to the question about resignation, I do believe that is premature at this point because the member is entitled to due process.
House Republicans, meanwhile, were not satisfied, and they are now calling for a special House investigation committee independent of the criminal proceedings. That's the first step in a process that could lead to Carol Ammons' ouster from the House, regardless of what the federal courts find. Here's House Republican leader Tony McCombie of Savannah during a news conference on Thursday.
Illinoisans deserve consistency, not political cover-ups. The House has an obligation to protect the integrity of this institution independent of the criminal justice system. Criminal proceedings determine guilt or innocence. The House determines whether its members are worthy of serving the people of Illinois.
So, Hannah, let's turn to you first because you wrote about the indictment when it first came down. Can you help us understand the indictment? What exactly is she being charged with?
Right. So Representative Ammons has been charged with a few different things, including wire fraud, including lying to an FBI agent, and including conspiracy to obstruct justice. And her husband has also been charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice and obstruction of justice, and we'll get to that in a minute. But basically, like you said, it's a combination of misusing campaign funds. Basically, we've seen this before. At least I've seen this before in my 13 years covering Illinois government politics. Writing checks to friends and family members who, either didn't do any work for the actual work for the campaign or overwriting checks so that the, some of it could go back to Representative Ammons in what the feds are calling cash kickbacks. And then the other part is, especially Democratic members, since Democrats are in charge of the General Assembly, they are empowered with pretty wide latitude to determine where some state grant money should go. And in this case, starting in 2019 for fiscal year 2020, Representative Ammons directed some state money to the Hood Vote Neighborhood Transformation nonprofit, with which her daughter, Titiana Ammons, was already associated. And then eventually, her daughter was promoted to a program director of this nonprofit. Somehow, the Pritzker administration got wind of that, and after she was, started to be paid a salary, they stepped in and said, this is an impermissible conflict of interest. You can't, your daughter can't be collecting a salary that is, pretty much entirely funded by a state grant that you decided would go, toward this nonprofit. And according to the indictment, once they learned about that, Representative Ammons didn't help renew that grant for the next year, and instead helped another nonprofit, the Bridgewater Sullivan Community Life Center, which is associated with a church in Champaign. Yet again, her daughter ended up being a program director at that nonprofit. And apparently, no one from the state stopped that, this next time. And then they did it one more time with the Champaign-Urbana Independent Media Center, where Representative Ammons used to work long ago. And in that case, her daughter received almost $10,000 in basically a consulting contract, I believe, in 2023. And in all of these cases, the feds say that her daughter and other unnamed individuals basically provided cash kickbacks to Representative Ammons. In the indictment, there is specific text messages which they say correspond to direct deposits into an individual's account. And, for example, she was using the word gift. So in June of 2022, Representative Ammons sent a text to that individual saying simply, "What's up? Gift." And in another one, in December 2022, the same day, another $500 deposit hit the credit union account. Ammons was more blunt, saying, "Hey, you dropping off my gift today?"
So, converting campaign funds for personal use by running them through other individuals, and then converting public funds and steering public funds toward organizations in which she or members of her family would personally benefit. Those are the allegations, of course.
Those are the allegations. And then, of course, she got herself, according to the indictment, into even more legal trouble by denying knowledge of the conflict of interest to an FBI agent when she was approached in May of 2024. And that's also where her husband, Champaign County Clerk Aaron Ammons, got involved. For more than a year after they were first approached, they were obviously now tipped off to the fact that the feds are looking into, their behavior with campaign finance and steering public funds. And Aaron Ammons allegedly, it's unclear from the indictment if it was the same individual, a potential witness, or three different people, but at least at three separate occasions, Aaron Ammons allegedly tried to tamper with the FBI investigation, including the last time basically telling, or the direct quote in the indictment is to tell the person to muddy the waters with the FBI. And then another time in, I believe it was February of 2025, he wrote a note to a potential witness saying it was perfectly legal, friends giving friends money, through campaign account. And then the indictment says he then destroyed the note, although it doesn't say how he destroyed the note. I would love to know, was it like chewed it up and ate it, or put it in the trash, flushed it down the toilet? It's unclear. So, and this also comes a little over a month after their daughter, the same daughter, Titiana Ammons, who is, referenced in this indictment. She's not indicted, she's not charged in this indictment, but separately, a month ago, She was charged with fraudulently obtaining unemployment benefits in, I believe, 2020 and 2021. Those, if folks remember, those enhanced COVID era unemployment benefits where it was an extra $300 a week on top of what, a person would already be entitled to. So she's facing those. She was a former member of the Champaign County Board. And I thought it was interesting when I went to go look for her own employment history this week, writing the story, her LinkedIn appeared to be deleted.
Okay. Well, now I want to turn to Ben because this is a developing story. In fact, even there has been breaking news even today as we speak, before we started recording this podcast. We heard the tape at the beginning. Obviously, Speaker Welch was being hit with questions as soon as news of the indictment came out. Now there is apparently Republicans have petitioned to form a special investigative committee, which is the first step in a process that could eventually lead to an ouster proceeding. Could you kind of recap what is this committee? How does it work? And what's the process here?
Yeah, this committee is easily set up. It only requires 3 members of the House to sign a petition to create it, to investigate another member. We will get more information, I think, in the coming days when more than likely the petition will be made public when the committee is actually set up. But for right now, we know it's almost certainly going to investigate everything Hannah was discussing there. But this committee is going to go through a process that we last saw in 2020 when Mike Madigan was also the subject of a special investigating committee. And it's kind of interesting, I think, how this one will play out given there are criminal charges already filed here. Mike Madigan, at the time of his committee, was not charged with a crime, though he was pretty clearly a suspect for one. But this committee is going to essentially investigate, did Carol Ammons do anything that's unbecoming of an elected official? Did she violate her oath of office, engage in inappropriate illegal activity that could potentially result in some sort of punishment, including being expelled from the Illinois House? But it's a really long process. And, the process that this first committee is going to undertake, it's a 6-member committee, 3 members from each party. And one of the issues that we saw with Mike Madigan's committee was, the 3 Democrats believed Mike Madigan was fine, that there was nothing to be punishing him for at the time. Obviously, we saw how that turned out later, but it's going to take at least one Democrat, assuming the Republicans do find that Carol Ammons did something wrong. It's going to take at least one Democrat to move this any sort of punishment forward, which would then go to a different 12-member committee that would be weighing that sort of punishment and what that punishment should be in more of a trial setting. And then after that, it would go up for a vote in the whole entire House. So there's a really long way to go in this. We will see how it turns out. Speaker Welch was on the record in 2020, and he's on the record again this year, saying that he believes that the best venue to decide these issues is the judicial system, which is where these charges have been brought. So we'll certainly see how this committee plays out, and even when it gets set up, there's no timeline for setting this committee up either.
Well, and I remember covering that committee in 2020. As you mentioned, it involved then Speaker Mike Madigan, who had not yet been charged with anything. But there had been a deferred prosecution agreement, and that's kind of what triggered the whole process, deferred prosecution agreement with Commonwealth Edison, in which ComEd basically confessed to a years-long scheme of bribing then Speaker Madigan in order to get favorable legislation through. What was interesting about that was the person who chaired the committee was Emanuel Chris Welch, who was then a representative who was sort of handpicked, I believe, by Mike Madigan to lead that committee. And, as you pointed out, it did not really hear from any witnesses. It didn't gather a whole lot of evidence. It went nowhere and did not result in any disciplinary action against the speaker. I want to turn to Jerry. There's an obvious temptation here to do a lot of compare and contrast. How did Speaker Welch handle that situation? There was another incident involving former Representative Luis Arroyo, and now these two involving Harry Benton and Carol Ammons. I guess the question is he being consistent in the way he handles these cases?
It's a hard comparison to compare it to when Madigan was being investigated. It was essentially Madigan was named in a deferred prosecution agreement that ComEd had agreed to. As Ben pointed out, he was not charged with anything yet, but there were a whole lot of documents to go through, a whole lot of documents that we spent a lot of time reading. And, the Republicans in that committee said there's enough here to say he's committed conduct unbecoming of a lawmaker. But ultimately, that process ended in December 2020, and then by January, Madigan was ousted as Speaker in favor of Welch. That was January 2021. So it wasn't long after that the House kind of solved their own problem with that, but there was still the lingering. Leader Jim Durkin at the time said Welch. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he was pretty upset with the way Welch handled it and sort of gavelled out without any discipline. So fast forward to now, the approach he took for Carol Ammons has been what is kind of a strikingly common approach he's taken, from crimes, alleged crimes, federal government. He alleged federal crimes for Carol Ammons. He's booted her from the caucus, cut off her access to staff, and stripped her of committees. But that's also the approach he took with Fred Crespo for doing the terrible thing of leading his own budget talks and trying to get his own budget bill passed. So I think he also did it with Mary Flowers, the representative who was supposedly mistreating staff, but not really accused of criminal wrongdoing. And then Benton, who, of course, we're still waiting to see if we'll ever see that report into his alleged wrongdoing, but some sources have told us that was sexual harassment. So, frankly, it does seem like a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach to do the type of internal stuff that he's done with these recent actions.
Well, I also want to point out that on the Senate side, we've seen kind of the same approach from Senate President Don Harmon and before him, Senate President John Cullerton. In 2019, we saw the indictment of then Senator Tom Cullerton on embezzlement charges. And then we saw Senator Terry Link kind of get named but not indicted, get named in actually Louis Arroyo's, his own charging documents. And we saw the very dramatic FBI sweep of the offices, both in the Capitol and up north of then Senator Marty Sandoval. Then in 2022, we saw the indictment of Senator Emil Jones. And in, I think, all of those cases, the senators remained in office till basically they were, ready to resign of their own volition. And in some of those cases, it actually took a long time. And in the case of Emil Jones, I covered the trial last spring where, he was accused of bribery and lying to the FBI, but in the end, the jury deadlocked because not enough jurors believed, that the government had truly proved their case against him. And he was reelected, and now he's, basically back to being a senator in good standing.
Well, those scandals weren't the only news of the week, even though that would have been enough to keep a lot of reporters busy for an entire week. Illinois' assault weapons ban was back in the headlines. This is the law that Illinois passed in the wake of a mass shooting at a 4th of July parade in Highland Park a few years back. A federal judge in the Southern District of Illinois earlier held that law unconstitutional, but Illinois appealed the case, and I believe it was 9 months after hearing oral arguments in that case last fall, the Seventh Circuit finally issued its opinion this week. Hannah, you covered that opinion when it came down. What did the Seventh Circuit find about the assault weapons ban?
Right. In a 2-1 decision, the appellate panel, I want to point out, jurists appointed by Republican presidents, including 2 by President Donald Trump himself in his first term. The panel found that Illinois' assault weapons ban aligns with what the U.S. Supreme Court has said is kind of the new way that all gun laws must be looked at. If folks remember, in the 2022 U.S. Supreme Court case, New York State Rifle Association, Bruin, the conservative majority in that decision said, hey, every gun law has to comport with the historical tradition of any sort of firearm restriction in U.S. history, particularly at the time of the ratification of the Bill of Rights in the late 1700s, when the country was, brand spanking new. And then the court decided in 2024 in U.S. versus Rahimi that a federal law saying, that bans people from possessing firearms if they have an active domestic violence restraining order against them is legal, because the court said, this does actually comport with historical, restrictions on the Second Amendment. And so in this Seventh Circuit opinion, the majority is saying, this is not unlike, for example, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, these things called Bowie knives, which I was only vaguely familiar with what they are. If anyone listening is not familiar, it's a huge sheath knife with a blade that could be anywhere from 5 to 12 inches. So really, really big. And it has a little thing at the very tip, a little split. So it could inflict a lot of damage. And at the time, in this pre-Civil War era, legislatures were banning the Bowie knife. They're banning the sale of it. They're banning, the use of it, with pretty heavy criminal penalties. So the majority here is saying, Illinois' assault weapons ban is not unlike that, because it's singling out a very dangerous weapon, a particularly dangerous weapon. The opinion deals in some, some detail about how damaging these bullets can be, and how much more damage they can inflict on a body's organs than a handgun, because the bullets just move so much faster. And, as we've seen many doctors testify, when they're testifying on, gun control laws, basically sometimes there's just nothing to sew together, because organs are so damaged from the violence that it's inflicted by these weapons. But in the dissent, Chief Justice of the Seventh Circuit, Michael Brennan, also a Trump appointee, he said, the majority has it all wrong, especially because these AR-15s, they're very popular. They're basically the weapon of choice for Americans to defend themselves. And the majority kind of took issue with that and said, it doesn't really matter whether, the numbers on how many people own these and how popular they are doesn't matter. It's really about the dangerousness. But nevertheless, the Seventh Circuit is not going to be the final arbiter on this, because this decision actually comes a week after the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to take up cases having to do with similar assault weapons bans, both in Cook County, so right here in Illinois, and in Connecticut. So probably a year from now, we'll know what the court believes on whether or not singling out dangerous weapons, these particularly dangerous weapons, does in fact comport with the 2022 edict on having to look at historical traditions of regulations.
So the U.S. Supreme Court is going to take this up, and whether or not they agreed that it's constitutional is still up in the air. So we'll wait to hear about that. Meanwhile, in other news this week, The Justice Department this week sent letters to chief election officers in all 50 states, threatening them with criminal prosecution if they allow non-citizens to cast ballots in their state, or if non-citizens even just remain on voter registration lists. The letter asks what steps those states are taking to make sure that doesn't happen and to respond within 5 days. The Illinois State Board of Elections says it's reviewing that letter. We'll see whether or not they respond to it. Interestingly, this letter went to the chief election officers in all 50 states. That includes North Dakota, which is interesting because I just learned North Dakota is the one state that does not have voter registration. There, apparently, you just show up with ID that says who you are and where you live and how old you are, and that's what it takes to vote in North Dakota. So I don't know how they're going to respond to this request about how they keep non-citizens off of their voter rolls when they don't have voter rolls. Finally, I wanted to spend a little time this week talking about education funding. This was a project I've been working on for a number of months, primarily because this new fiscal year that started July 1st marks the 10th year of funding under the evidence-based funding model in Illinois. That's the model that lawmakers adopted in 2017 to straighten out what was considered at the time to be one of the most inequitable school funding systems in the country. The system at that time was marked by huge disparities, both in terms of per pupil spending across the state's 850 or so school districts, but also in terms of property taxes that districts levy to fund their share of education costs. The new system is based on coming up with a rational or evidence-based estimate of what an adequate level of spending in each district is supposed to be, and then ever so gradually adding money to the formula each year to bring the least funded districts up to an adequate level of funding. You can read that story on capitalnewsillinois.com, but the gist of it is that Illinois has made some progress over the years in closing some of the spending gaps, but there are still wide disparities in property tax rates. Jerry, you did a lot of work in helping edit that project, for which I'm very grateful. What were your thoughts at the end of that? You've grown up here in Illinois. You've gone through Illinois schools. What were your thoughts about the fact that it's taken so long to achieve equity in school finance here?
Yeah, first of all, great job on that story. And I think one of my first thoughts was, geez, the State Board of Education's got to have a clearer database for this data. But I think you did a good job compiling it from the various sources and checking out your sources to help you fill in the gaps there. But what it comes down to is Illinois was, and I think you quoted this expert here saying it, but Mr. Bruce Baker, the expert we'll talk about later, but Illinois was very bad before the evidence-based funding came into effect. And I that was ingrained in my head as I covered the Leroy School Board back before I was at Capital News Illinois. And the number that was ingrained in my head, they funded it at a base rate of $6,119 per pupil, and then just prorated each year as state finances became worse, and they withheld mandated categorical payments. So there was no certainty or stability for school districts. They never knew how big their check would be from the state. So it really kind of threw things off, especially in towns like Leroy or Farmer City, where I covered, where, they couldn't plan too well, saying, we're still behind on the state funds, but that money will come in somewhere. So the big thing, I think you quoted a small superintendent as well, that this sort of lets them know how much is coming and when it's coming, and gives a clear cadence to funding for districts. But I don't know, do you want to go into a little bit more about Bruce Baker, who he is, and what he told you about how Illinois has sort of transformed here?
Yeah, Bruce Baker is an academic. He's now at the University of Miami. I think he was previously at Rutgers, and he's had a long academic career in the school finance field. but he's come up with models that basically describe how equitable and how progressive any given state's school funding system is. And he has also been what you'd say an expert witness in a number of school finance trials. We're not too familiar with that here in Illinois for various reasons, but in other states, states have been sued under their state constitutions for failing to adequately and equitably fund their public schools. And he's frequently called as an expert witness in a lot of those trials. And so that's basically how I became familiar with him. And you're right. He was saying that for a long time he considered Illinois and Pennsylvania to be the two worst states in the country. Illinois is maybe not at the bottom anymore, but he says, it's still not real great. And one of the big differences between Illinois and other states really is the legal environment. He says that in other states, you can sue the legislature or you can sue the state in general for failing to fund education according to state constitutional standards, and the Illinois Supreme Court simply has not allowed that here. There have been a couple of attempts to bring school finance lawsuits through state courts, and the Supreme Court here has thrown them both out, basically saying it's a political question that they're not going to get into. And so there's no other branch of government that is willing to hold the legislature's feet to the fire. And so, whatever the legislature determines is appropriate, that's the way schools get funded here.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that just the pace of funding for $300 million new each year just is not driving them to adequacy anywhere near as quickly as lawmakers had initially hoped. I think the State Board of Education even said this year that they'd need, I think it was $3 billion more to fully get everyone to 90% adequacy. But I mean, it was interesting to me that, it is making the property tax gap a little narrower in terms of, did you want to say anything more about how it's the rates people are paying based on their wealth?
Yeah, generally speaking, is that the wealthier districts, and you can imagine districts that are characterized by million-dollar mansions, pay much lower property tax rates than lower income, lower wealth districts, because you have to charge a higher rate when you don't have that much property tax wealth in order to generate, let's say, $1 million or $5 million to build a new building. It just takes a higher rate in a lower wealth district than in a higher wealth district. And as a result, we have a very regressive sort of tax system where the districts with the least wealth and the least, you would presume, the least ability to afford the taxes are paying higher rates than those with the greatest ability to pay.
Well, certainly an interesting read for me. I'd encourage our listeners to go ahead and read that story and dig into the data and the graphs and see all Peter's hard work.
Well, thank you for that. And that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. I want to thank Ben Szalinski, Hannah Meisel, and Jerry Nowicki for being here this week. On behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.